Welcome back. Some mysteries begin with a scream, some begin with a whisper. This one begins with silence, a white veil, perfectly placed, perfectly still. And beneath it, a dark red stain spreading slowly across the marble floor of London's most elegant hotel. The bride was here, the guests were waiting, the flowers were fresh, and then she was gone. No struggle, no farewell, no body, just blood. And questions that nobody dared to ask out loud. This is the Savoy Hotel, London. The year is 1952, and somewhere inside these gilded walls, a woman has vanished on the most important day of her life. Was she running from something? Or was she taken by someone? Only one man notices what others cannot see. A small man, precise, particular, with a magnificent moustache and a mind like a steel trap. Hercule Poirot is in the building, and he has exactly 24 hours before the truth disappears forever. Stay with us. Every detail matters, every silence speaks. The story begins now. The morning of white lace. The eggs were perfect. That at least was something. Hercule Poirot sat alone at his usual corner table in the Savoy's dining room, a crisp white napkin folded across his lap, and regarded his breakfast with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understands that small pleasures are not small at all. The eggs, lightly poached, precisely 2 minutes and 40 seconds, he had instructed the waiter with great seriousness, sat in their silver dish like two pale suns. The toast was cut into exact triangles. The coffee was hot. Outside, London was doing what London always did in October. It was grey. It was damp. The Thames moved somewhere below the embankment with the slow, indifferent patience of something very old. Poirot was not in London for a case, and he was in London because his apartment on Whitehaven Mansions was being repainted, a tiresome business that had driven him for 3 days to the civilized refuge of the Savoy. He had brought 2 books, his correspondence, and absolutely no intention of becoming involved in anyone else's troubles. He was sipping his second cup of coffee when he first saw her. She came into the dining room at precisely 8:47. Poirot noted the time without thinking, the way other men might note a pretty face. She was young, 24, perhaps 25, dark hair pinned up with a careful effort of someone who had tried very hard to look composed. She wore a pale blue dress, simple and well made, and she walked with the posture of a woman who had been taught to hold herself straight, even when everything inside her was leaning sideways. She was the bride. He knew it immediately, not from any single detail, but from the sum of all of them. The slight puffiness beneath the eyes that powder had not quite concealed. The way her hands, when she sat down at the table near the window, immediately reached for the salt shaker and then put it back without using it. The glance she threw toward the door, quick, almost involuntary, like a person who is always expecting someone to walk in. Not excitement, not nerves of the ordinary bridal variety. Something else. Poirot had seen that look before on different faces in different countries. It was the look of a person standing at the edge of something they could not come back from. He returned to his eggs. It was not his business. Her name, he would learn later, was Eleanor Voss, 26 years old. Daughter of the late Reginald Voss, a banker of some reputation and considerably more debt as it turned out. Eleanor had grown up in a large house in Wiltshire that smelled of old paper and financial anxiety, and she had come to London at 19 with good manners, reasonable beauty and very little else. She was, by all accounts, a sensible young woman, quiet, thoughtful, the sort of person who remembered birthdays and returned borrowed books. She was to be married at 11 o'clock that morning to Mr. Edward Hartwell. Edward Hartwell was 41. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that photographers liked. Strong jaw, steady eyes, the suggestion of authority without cruelty. He had made his money in shipping, and he wore it the way certain men do, not loudly, but everywhere. In the cut of his suit and the weight of his cufflinks and the particular way he paused before speaking, as though he expected the room to wait for him, which it generally did. Poirot had seen him in the lobby the previous evening speaking to the hotel manager. He had not paid much attention. He paid attention now in retrospect, the way one always does when things have gone wrong, turning the memory over like a stone to see what lived underneath. Hartwell had been calm, very calm. He had spoken to the manager in a low, measured voice, and the manager had nodded repeatedly in the manner of a man who very much wishes to please and is slightly afraid of failing. Nothing unusual in that. Rich men often had that effect on hotel managers, but Poirot remembered something else now, a small thing. As Hartwell had turned to leave, he had caught the eye of a young woman sitting in the lobby, dark-haired, sharp-faced, with the alert posture of someone paid to notice things. She had given the briefest nod, and Hartwell had looked away without acknowledging it. Not rudeness, something more deliberate than rudeness, a signal of some kind, or the absence of one. Poirot filed it away in the neat, well-organised library of his little grey cells and thought no more of it. Until, of course, everything changed. The wedding was to take place in the Savoy's private chapel, a small, elegant room on the second floor, white flowers everywhere, 20 or so guests arranged in quiet anticipation. Poirot knew all this because Mr. Aldous Finch, the hotel manager, was a nervous man who talked when he was anxious, and he had been anxious since Thursday. Finch was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the permanently slightly startled expression of a man who has spent 30 years ensuring that wealthy people are comfortable and has found it more demanding than it sounds. He was conscientious, efficient, and deeply, fundamentally terrified of scandal. The Savoy had a reputation. The Savoy had always had a reputation, and it was Aldous Finch's solemn professional duty to ensure that nothing happened within these walls that might cause a journalist to reach for a pencil. At 10:45 that morning, Finch appeared at Poirot's table. He was pale. His hands were doing something complicated with the buttons of his jacket. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, in a voice carefully designed to carry no further than necessary. "I wonder if I might. That is, I find myself in need of—" "Sit down, mon ami," Poirot said, with the patient resignation of a man who has long since accepted that his breakfast will always be interrupted. "And tell me what has happened." Finch sat. He looked at his hands. He looked at the door. He looked at Poirot. "The bride," he said. "She's gone." Poirot set down his coffee cup with great care. "Gone," he repeated. "Her maid went up to the bridal suite at 10:15 to help her with the veil. The door was unlocked. The room it appeared undisturbed mostly, but Miss Voss was not there." Finch's voice dropped further. "There was blood, Monsieur Poirot. Not a great deal, but on the floor, near the window, and the veil was there, laid out on the carpet as though someone had placed it there deliberately." "The window," Poirot said. "Open or closed?" Finch blinked. Closed, I believe. I didn't—" "The blood. Fresh or dried?" Fresh, I think. I did not examine it closely, I'm afraid. I came to find you immediately." "Quite right," Poirot said, though his tone suggested he wished Finch had examined it more closely before coming to find him. He folded his napkin. He straightened his already straight cuffs. He thought, briefly and without particular pleasure, of his 2 unread books, and his very comfortable room, and his original intention of becoming involved in no one's troubles. "The groom," he said. "Where is Mr. Hartwell?" "In the chapel, waiting. He doesn't know yet." "And the guests?" "Still seated. We told them there was a small delay. Monsieur Poirot—" Finch leaned forward, his voice very nearly a whisper now. "I cannot have a scandal. Not here. Not the Savoy. Whatever has happened, I need this resolved quietly." "You need the truth," Poirot said, standing and reaching for his jacket. "The truth, Mr. Finch, is always the beginning of quiet. It is the lies that make noise." He paused. "Take me to the bridal suite." The suite was on the 4th floor at the end of a carpeted corridor that smelled of fresh flowers and furniture polish. The door stood slightly ajar. Poirot paused before it, studying the frame, the handle, the carpet immediately outside. Nothing remarkable. He pushed it open. The room was beautiful. It was also wrong. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a small, very still figure, and let his eyes move slowly from left to right. The dressing table, perfume bottles arranged neatly, powder compact open, a single earring lying on its side. The bed, still made, untouched. The chaise longue near the window, empty. A pair of white gloves on the armchair, small bouquet of white roses on the table, already beginning to lean. And there, on the floor near the window, the veil. It was ivory, not quite white, edged with fine lace, and it had been laid out with a strange, almost deliberate neatness, as though folded by careful hands. Beside it, soaking slowly into the pale carpet, was a dark stain approximately the size of a man's palm. Poirot crouched beside it with some difficulty. His knees were not what they had been, a fact he acknowledged privately and never mentioned, and examined the stain without touching it. Fresh, not more than an hour old. He looked at the veil, he looked at the window, he looked at the ceiling. Then he stood, slowly, and crossed to the dressing table, the single earring. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the small drawer beneath the mirror, not snooping, he would have said, merely being thorough, and found, beneath a folded handkerchief, a piece of paper. It had been torn from a larger sheet. On it, in a hasty, uneven hand, the writing of someone in a hurry or in distress, were 6 words. "He knows. I had no choice." Poirot read it twice. He folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. "Mr. Finch," he said, without turning around, "I will need to speak to everyone. The groom, the maid of honour, every member of the staff who was on this floor this morning." He paused. "And I will need another cup of coffee." He looked once more at the veil on the floor, at the blood beside it, at the window, closed and latched, with the grey London sky pressing against the glass. Or somewhere in this hotel, or perhaps somewhere beyond it, Eleanor Voss had vanished, and she had left behind exactly what she wanted him to find. The question was whether he was clever enough to understand it. Blood on the ivory veil. The chapel smelled of lilies. Poirot noticed this as he passed the half-open door on his way back from the bridal suite. The warm, heavy sweetness of cut flowers in a closed room, underlaid with something older, something that belonged to old stone and quiet prayer. Through the gap he could see a slice of the assembled guests. White gloves, dark suits, the careful stillness of people who have been told to wait and are beginning to suspect that waiting is all they will be doing. At the front, with his back to the door, stood Edward Hartwell. He was not fidgeting, he was not checking his watch. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, very straight, very still, staring at the altar with the fixed patience of a man who has decided to feel nothing until he is given a reason to feel something. Poirot watched him for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he walked on. The first order of business was the floor. Poirot had asked Finch, with considerable firmness, that no one enter the bridal suite until he had finished his examination. Finch had agreed with the desperate eagerness of a man grateful to be told what to do. A young constable had been summoned from the street. Finch had not wanted police involvement, but Poirot had been quietly insistent on this point, and there was something about Poirot's quiet insistence that made argument feel exhausting before it had properly begun. Now Poirot stood again in the centre of the suite, his coffee cooling on the dressing table beside him, and conducted what he privately called his second conversation with the room. The first conversation, the one where you looked at everything quickly and formed impressions, that had already happened. The second conversation was slower, more deliberate, the kind where you crouched in uncomfortable positions and peered at things that other people would walk past without a second glance. He began with the blood. It was, as he had noted before, not a large quantity, enough to alarm. Not enough, not in itself, to suggest something fatal. A cut hand, perhaps. A wound to the arm. He looked at the pattern of it on the carpet. It had not dripped but pooled, which suggested the source had been held still, or had been placed there. There were no drag marks, no footprints in the blood, no smearing, which meant in all likelihood that Eleanor Voss had not been dragged through it, which meant she had either bled and then walked away under her own power, or the blood was not hers at all. Poirot straightened up and looked at the veil again. It was laid out with that same peculiar neatness he had noticed before, not dropped, not discarded, arranged. The lace edges were smoothed flat. The fabric was uncrumpled. Someone, Eleanor herself most probably, had taken the time to lay this veil down carefully, as though it were something being put away rather than abandoned. Why? He thought about the 6 words on the paper. He knows. I had no choice. He knows what, and what choice had been removed from her. He crossed to the window and examined it thoroughly. The latch was secured from the inside, no scratches on the frame, no marks on the outside ledge that he could see. The window opened onto a narrow inner courtyard 4 floors below, not impossible to descend, but extremely difficult, and not without noise or injury. She had not left by the window. He turned his attention to the walls. This was, he would reflect later, the moment when the case changed shape. The Savoy was an old building, not ancient, or it had been substantially rebuilt in the early part of the century, but old enough to have been modified, expanded, rearranged over decades in the way that grand hotels always are. Poirot had stayed here often enough to know that certain rooms had histories more interesting than their current wallpaper suggested. He pressed his palm flat against the wall to the left of the wardrobe, a section of panelling that was, if you were paying attention, I am very slightly less flush with the wall than it should be, a gap of perhaps 2 millimeters, barely visible, the kind of thing you would never notice if you were a bride in distress and simply looking for a way out, unless you had known it was there. He pressed. He pushed slightly upward, and the panel shifted. Behind it, a narrow passage, no wider than a man's shoulders, running parallel to the outer wall in absolute darkness. The air inside was cold and tasted of old dust and something faintly metallic. Poirot produced a small torch from his jacket pocket. He was, in certain practical matters, a man of habitual preparation, and shone it into the dark. The passage ran perhaps 15 feet before turning left. The floor was thick with dust except for one place, a long uneven trail where something or someone had disturbed it very recently. Boot marks or shoe marks, heading away from the suite. Poirot stood at the entrance of the passage and did not go in. He was 63 years old. His knees had already expressed their opinion of this morning. The passage was dark and narrow and smelled unpleasant, and he already had what he needed from it, which was the knowledge that Eleanor Voss had known it existed and had used it. This was not a woman who had been taken. This was a woman who had planned. He stepped back, closed the panel, and went to drink his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway, standing at the window, looking out at the grey sky, and thinking about a bride who had arranged her own veil on the floor of her bridal suite with the calm precision of someone leaving a message, and then walked into a wall and disappeared. He knows. I had no choice. She had been afraid, but she had also been prepared. These two things, Poirot thought, did not always go together. When they did, it usually meant that the fear had been present for a long time, long enough to make a plan. He found Diana Marsh in the small sitting room adjacent to the lobby, where Finch had installed the wedding party with apologies and tea, and the firm assurance that everything was perfectly fine, which no one believed. Diana was the maid of honour. Poirot had identified her from Finch's hasty description. Young woman, brown hair, been crying. Though this description applied to perhaps a third of the women in the room, he identified her specifically because she was the only one who was not crying anymore. She was sitting very straight in a green armchair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision about what they are and are not going to say. Poirot sat down across from her without being invited. He accepted a cup of tea from a passing waiter and stirred it twice, though he had not added anything to stir. "Miss Marsh," he said pleasantly, "I am Hercule Poirot. I wonder if you might help me." Diana looked at him. She had intelligent eyes, dark brown, slightly red-rimmed from earlier tears, but sharp. She was perhaps 28, and she had the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. "I've already spoken to the manager," she said. "Yes," Poirot said, "and now you will speak to me. It is, I think, or not quite the same thing." A pause, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a decision, but the beginning of one. "I don't know where Eleanor is," she said. "That," said Poirot, "is the first true thing you have said since I sat down, which means, unfortunately, that everything before it was not quite true." He tilted his head slightly. "You're not surprised that she is gone, Miss Marsh. You are frightened. These are different emotions, and they require different facts to produce them." Diana's hands tightened in her lap. "Just slightly. Just enough." "I was worried about her," she said carefully. "I have been worried about her for some time." "About the marriage?" A long pause. "About Eleanor," Diana said. "About whether she was all right." "She was not all right," Poirot said gently. "We both know this. The question I am asking you, Miss Marsh, is why? Why was Eleanor Voss not all right? What was she afraid of?" Diana looked at him for a long moment. Outside in the corridor, footsteps passed, heavy, deliberate, and she glanced toward the door with an expression that was over almost before it began, but not quite fast enough for Poirot to miss. Fear, quick and automatic. The kind that lives in the body before the mind has caught up. "I think," she said quietly, "that there are things I cannot tell you. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't know who is listening." Poirot set down his tea. "Bien," he said softly. Then we will return to this conversation later. You and I, somewhere quieter," he stood. "But I will tell you one thing, Miss Marsh. Whatever Eleanor was running from, she planned her escape very carefully. She is, I think, a resourceful young woman." He paused. "She left behind certain things, a veil, a note, a trail of evidence that tells a particular story." He looked at her steadily. "I am still deciding whether that story is the true one, or whether it is the story she wanted me to find." Diana Marsh said nothing, but her eyes, those sharp red-rimmed eyes, said rather a lot. Hartwell was waiting for him in the corridor. This too, Poirot noted, not seated in the sitting room with the other guests, not pacing in the chapel, standing in the corridor outside the bridal suite, arms crossed, jaw set, with the focused stillness of a man who has positioned himself where he intends to be and is waiting to see who comes to him. He was impressive, Poirot admitted to himself. There was a physicality to Hartwell's presence. Not aggression exactly, but weight. The sense that the air around him had been slightly rearranged to accommodate him. "Monsieur Poirot," Hartwell said. His voice was exactly as Poirot had expected. Low, controlled, accustomed to being the only voice in a room. "I'm told you've been brought in to find Eleanor." "I have been asked to look into the matter, yes," Poirot said agreeably. "Then let me save you some time." Hartwell uncrossed his arms. "Eleanor has been under considerable strain. The wedding, the preparations. She is a sensitive woman, high-strung. I believe she has simply overwhelmed herself, gone somewhere to compose herself." He paused. "There is no mystery here, Monsieur Poirot. There is no crime. There is a nervous bride who will return when she has gathered herself." Poirot regarded him with polite interest. "And the blood?" he said. Hartwell's expression did not change, not a flicker. "I wasn't aware of blood," he said. "Ah," said Poirot, "that is interesting." "Why is it interesting?" "Because Mr. Finch told you before he came to me. I asked him specifically what he had told you, and he was—" Poirot smiled apologetically. "Not a very accomplished liar. He told you everything, including the blood." He tilted his head. "So when you say you were not aware of it, Mr. Hartwell, you are telling me something. Not about the blood, about yourself." A long silence. In the corridor, a door opened and closed somewhere distant. "Find her," Hartwell said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something beneath it had shifted like weight moving in deep water. "Find her quickly, Monsieur Poirot, so before this becomes something that cannot be contained." He turned and walked back toward the stairs, slow, deliberate steps, a man in no hurry. Poirot watched him go. "He knows. I had no choice." He reached into his breast pocket and touched the folded note without taking it out. The little grey cells, which had been warming up slowly all morning like an engine on a cold day, were now fully engaged. Edward Hartwell, he thought, was a man accustomed to containing things. The question was what exactly needed to be contained, and whether Eleanor Voss, somewhere out there in the grey October city, or perhaps still hidden somewhere in these gilded walls, had finally found a way to make sure it couldn't be. The secrets of the guests. Poirot needed another coffee. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that when the waiter brought it, a young man, efficient, slightly nervous in the way that all Savoy staff were slightly nervous today, Poirot accepted it, took one sip, and then simply held the cup in both hands without drinking. Warming his fingers, thinking. He did this sometimes. Hastings had once pointed it out years ago, with the affectionate bewilderment of a man watching someone do something entirely pointless. "You're not drinking it, Poirot, you're just holding it." And Poirot had said, "Yes, mon ami, sometimes the hands must be occupied so that the mind may be free." Hastings had not entirely understood this. But then Hastings had not entirely understood many things, and Poirot had loved him for it. He was sitting now in the small reading room off the main corridor, a quiet room, lined with books that no one read, furnished with 2 leather armchairs and a writing desk and a window that looked onto the inner courtyard. The same courtyard, he noted, that the bridal suite window overlooked. 4 floors up. He looked at the courtyard from this angle, ground level, and confirmed what he had already suspected. The drop from the suite window was considerable, not survivable without a rope or considerable luck. She had used the passage. She had known about the passage. This knowledge sat at the centre of his thinking like a stone in still water, sending rings outward in every direction. Who had told her about it? Or had she discovered it herself? And if she had known about it for some time, days, weeks, then when had she decided to use it? He knows. I had no choice. He set down the coffee. He picked up his small notebook, pale blue cover, very neat handwriting inside, and wrote 3 names. Diana Marsh, Lord Ashby, the bearer who saw something. He underlined the 3rd name twice, then crossed it out and wrote it again more slowly, as though the act of writing it carefully might produce information he did not yet have. Then he went to find Lord Ashby. Lord Gerald Ashby was not difficult to find because he was not apparently trying to be anywhere in particular. He was standing in the corridor near the lift, smoking a cigarette with the unhurried manner of a man for whom the entire unpleasant situation was a spectacle of moderate interest rather than a personal emergency. He was 60, perhaps 62, with white hair, a red face, and the particular physical confidence of a man who had been tall and broad in his youth and had carried the memory of it into age. He wore his suit well. He had the hands of someone who had once done physical work and had spent the subsequent decades trying to forget it. He looked at Poirot with sharp blue eyes and did not seem surprised to see him. "You'll be the detective fellow," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am Hercule Poirot," Poirot agreed. "You are Lord Ashby. You knew Miss Voss." "I know a great many people." Ashby drew on his cigarette. "Eleanor I've known since she was a girl, more or less. Her father and I were at school together. Reginald Voss." Something moved briefly in his expression. Not grief exactly, but the shadow of it. The place where grief had been and had partially faded. "He died 3 years ago. Nasty business. Left Eleanor in a very difficult position. Financially, socially, every which way, really." Ashby looked at the end of his cigarette. "Reginald had debts, rather a lot of them. The house had to go. Eleanor had to do something." He paused. "She was a sensible girl. She found a position. She managed. And then she met Mr. Hartwell. And then," Ashby said, with a flatness that told Poirot a great deal, "she met Mr. Hartwell." Poirot waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of his more underrated qualities. Ashby dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath his shoe with more force than was strictly necessary. "Hartwell is a capable man," he said. "Successful, respected in certain circles." He said the word respected the way one might say convenient or temporary. "He met Eleanor at a charity function 14 months ago. He was attentive, generous. He paid off the last of her father's debts. Did it quietly, no fanfare, very decent of him." A pause. "Eleanor told me about it. She seemed grateful, relieved." He looked at Poirot. "She did not seem happy." "When did she last seem happy?" Poirot asked. Ashby thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Before Reginald died," he said. "Before all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "She used to laugh easily. You know the type. Not performative, not polite laughing. Real laughing. She had a lightness about her." He stopped. "I hadn't seen that in some time. Did you speak with her recently, before today?" "Last week, Wednesday evening. She came to tea." Ashby's jaw tightened. "She seemed wound very tightly. She asked me, quite casually, as though it were nothing, whether I knew anything about the history of the Savoy, the building itself, its older parts." He looked at Poirot carefully. "I thought it was an odd question at the time. I told her what I knew, which was not much, but I did mention, I'd read somewhere years ago, that in the older wing there were service passages, built for the original staff, most sealed off now." He stopped. Poirot regarded him steadily. "You did not think of this," Poirot said gently, "when you heard she had vanished." "I thought of it immediately," Ashby said. His voice was very quiet. "I thought of it, and I said nothing because—" He stopped again. He looked at his hands. "Because if Eleanor used that passage to get herself out of this hotel and away from that man, then I'm not going to be the one who makes it easier to find her." The corridor was very quiet. "Lord Ashby," Poirot said, after a moment, "what is it that Mr. Hartwell knows? Or what is it that he has done?" Ashby looked at him for a long time. "I don't know the specifics," he said finally. "I have suspicions. Eleanor never told me directly. She was protecting me, I think. She was always protecting someone." He straightened. "But I'll tell you this, Monsieur Poirot, and I'll tell you plainly. Edward Hartwell is a man who collects things. Properties, contracts, businesses." He paused. "People. He collects them," Poirot said. "And what does he do when they become inconvenient?" Ashby said nothing, but his silence, Poirot thought, was extremely eloquent. The bearer's name was Thomas Crail. He was 19 years old, and he had been employed at the Savoy for 11 months, and he was currently sitting in the staff room on the lower ground floor eating a sandwich with the focused dedication of someone who is very hungry and is not going to let the collapse of the morning's wedding plans interfere with lunch. He looked up when Poirot appeared in the doorway. "You're the Belgian gentleman from 412, he said, with the directness of the young. "I am," Poirot said, slightly startled. "You know my room number? I brought up your luggage Tuesday. You gave me £50 and told me the handles on the brown case needed restitching." Thomas looked entirely unbothered by this. "You're looking into where the bride went?" "I am," Poirot said again, and sat down across from him. "And I am told you saw something this morning." "On the 4th floor." Thomas chewed his sandwich thoughtfully. "I saw lots of things," he said. "I'm on 4th floor rounds, 7 to 11. I see things all morning." "Specifically," Poirot said patiently, "between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, on the 4th floor corridor near the bridal suite." Thomas put down his sandwich. "I saw a woman," he said. "Not the bride. I know what the bride looks like. I'd seen her the day before when she arrived. This was someone else. Tall woman, dark coat. She came out of the stairwell at the end of the corridor, not the lift, the stairs, and walked quickly toward the suite. She had something in her hand, small. I couldn't see what." "Did she go into the suite?" "She knocked first. Very quiet, barely a knock, more like a signal. Then the door opened and she went in." He paused. "She was only in there 3 or 4 minutes. Then she came out again. She didn't have the thing in her hand anymore." "And she left by the stairs again?" "Yes." He picked up his sandwich. "She walked like she knew where she was going. Not a guest. Guests walk like they're looking for something. She walked like staff, like she had somewhere to be. Could you describe her more precisely?" Thomas considered. 30, maybe a bit more. Sharp face, brown hair, very neat. She moved quickly but not rushed, if you know what I mean. Efficient-like. Poirot was very still. Brown hair, sharp face, efficient. Diana Marsh had been crying in the sitting room when Poirot had found her, with the particular neatness of someone who had composed themselves after a period of distress. She had told him she did not know where Eleanor was. That, he had said to her, was the first true thing, which meant she had known everything else. He found Diana in the same green armchair. The tea in front of her was cold and untouched, which told Poirot that she had been sitting here thinking rather than drinking, and that the thinking had not been going well. She looked up when he came in, and he saw the precise moment she decided something. A small, almost invisible squaring of the shoulders, the kind of decision that looks like stillness from the outside but is in fact the opposite. "You were in the suite this morning," Poirot said. He did not sit down. He stood across from her, his hands folded in front of him. "Between 10 and 10:15, before the maid went up, you brought something to Eleanor, something small." Diana looked at him. "You had a choice," Poirot continued more gently. "You could lie again. It is not perhaps a very comfortable position. Lying to Hercule Poirot is tiring work, I'm told. Or you could tell me what you brought her." He paused. "I think you are helping her. I think you have been helping her for some time, and I think that the thing you brought her this morning was something she needed in order to leave." The room was quiet. Outside, a taxi horn sounded in the street, distant and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the particular weight of this moment. Diana closed her eyes for 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had changed. "Money," she said. "I brought her money, and a train ticket." She looked at her hands. "And a key to a flat in Edinburgh. It belongs to a friend of mine. She's abroad until December. Eleanor can stay there. She'll be safe there." Poirot sat down now, slowly. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. 6 weeks, Diana said. "Since she told me." She stopped, swallowed. "Since she told me what he had threatened her with." "And what?" Poirot said very quietly. "Had he threatened her with?" Diana looked at him for a long moment, assessing him, he thought, deciding how much of the truth was safe. He waited with the patience of a man who has learned that the right silence is sometimes more persuasive than the cleverest question. "Eleanor's brother," Diana said at last. "James Voss. He's 22. He got into some trouble 2 years ago. Financial trouble. The sort that could mean prison. Hartwell found out about it. Bought the debt. Bought the people involved. She said this with a flat precision that told Poirot she had thought about it so many times it had lost the power to shock her. He told Eleanor that if she refused to marry him, he would see to it that James went to prison. If she tried to leave before the wedding, same result. If she told anyone at all, same result. But she told you, Poirot said. She told me because she had no one else, Diana said. And because she was running out of time. She looked at him steadily. I am not anyone, Monsieur Poirot. I am her friend. And I decided some time ago that whatever Hartwell threatened, it was better than what he was doing to her. Poirot was quiet for a moment. He thought of Eleanor at breakfast, the salt shaker picked up and put down, the glance at the door, the posture of a woman holding herself upright by will alone. He thought of the veil arranged on the floor with quiet deliberateness, a woman leaving a scene, controlling, even in flight, what the scene would say. He thought of 6 words on a torn piece of paper. He knows. I had no choice. Not. He knows about me. Not. He knows what I've done. He knows. Present tense. General. As though what Hartwell knew was something larger than a single secret. Miss Marsh, Poirot said. You said Eleanor told you what Hartwell threatened her with. Did she also tell you what she knew about him? What she had discovered that made her a liability to him beyond the merely marital? Diana's expression shifted. She found something, Diana said slowly, in his study 6 weeks ago. She didn't tell me everything. She said the less I knew, the safer I would be, but she said it was enough to destroy him. Completely. What kind of destruction? Poirot asked. Social, financial, legal? Diana looked at him. All 3, she said. The little grey cells hummed with quiet satisfaction. He knows. I had no choice. Eleanor had not written those words in despair. She had written them as explanation, as justification, perhaps, to whoever found the note, which she had calculated would be someone intelligent enough to look in the drawer. She had written them to Poirot. She had not known his name, of course. But she had left behind, Poirot thought, precisely the breadcrumbs required for a mind like his to follow. The veil, the note, the unlocked door, the passage. She had been hoping for someone to understand, and perhaps. He allowed himself this thought only briefly, because modesty was not always his strongest quality, but he tried. Perhaps she'd gotten rather more than she'd hoped for. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Diana with an expression that was, she would remember later, surprisingly kind. You did well by her, he said. Whatever happens next, you did well by her. Diana said nothing, but something in her face, very quietly, came slightly undone. In the corridor, Poirot paused. He had 3 interviews done. He had a picture that was becoming clearer at the edges but was still dark at the centre. He had a missing woman who was, he now believed, not missing at all but hidden, and hiding by choice, with help, and with something in her possession that a powerful and dangerous man very much wanted back. He had, he thought, approximately 18 hours before Hartwell's patience gave out, and he stopped pretending this was about a nervous bride and started doing something about it. He needed to think. He needed, more pressingly, another cup of coffee. He turned toward the dining room, moving at his usual measured pace, and was almost at the end of the corridor when he stopped. He had been thinking all morning about the sharp-faced woman in the lobby, the one he had seen the previous evening exchanging that brief deliberate non-acknowledgement with Hartwell. He had filed her away. He had described her to himself as dark-haired, sharp-faced, alert, paid to notice things. Thomas Crail had described the woman who visited Eleanor's suite as 30, maybe a bit more, sharp face, brown hair, very neat. She moved quickly but not rushed, efficient. Poirot had assumed, immediately and without sufficient consideration, that Thomas was describing Diana Marsh. But Diana Marsh had brown hair and a sharp face, yes, and she was efficient. But she was 28, and she was slight, and Poirot had sat across from her for 10 minutes and had not once thought the word tall. Thomas had said, tall woman. Diana Marsh was not tall. Poirot stood very still in the corridor. He had made an error, not a large one, not yet, but an error nonetheless. The woman in the suite had not been Diana Marsh at all. Diana had brought Eleanor money and a train ticket and a key, yes, but she had not been the one to deliver them. There was someone else, someone tall, dark-haired, sharp-faced, moving through this hotel with the quiet efficiency of a person who knew exactly where to go and why. And Poirot had seen her the previous evening standing in the lobby, receiving a signal from Edward Hartwell. He stood in the corridor for a full 30 seconds, entirely still, thinking about this with great concentration. Then he went and got his coffee. He needed it rather more than he had previously estimated. The locked room and the hidden door. The coffee helped. It did not solve anything. Coffee rarely solved anything, despite what certain optimistic people believed. But it organized his thoughts into something more manageable. Poirot sat at his corner table in the dining room for precisely 12 minutes, drank his coffee with the focused attention of a man performing a small ritual, and thought about tall women. The woman in the lobby last night. She had been standing near the fireplace. He reconstructed the memory carefully, the way you might unfold a map that had been in your pocket too long. Dark coat, dark hair. She had been holding nothing. No bag, no drink, no newspaper, which was itself slightly unusual for someone simply waiting in a hotel lobby. People in hotel lobbies always held something. It was a social reflex. It had the need for a prop. She had held nothing. She had simply stood and watched, and Hartwell had walked past her, and the non-acknowledgement had happened. That fractional, deliberate absence of recognition that was, in its way, more communicative than a greeting. Not strangers, not quite colleagues. Something in between, or something that needed to appear like strangers in a public place. Poirot turned his cup in its saucer. Thomas Crail had said she moved like staff, like she had somewhere to be, not a guest. But Poirot had seen her in the lobby in the evening. Not a staff area, not a service corridor. The lobby, which meant she had access to both worlds. She could move through guest spaces without attracting attention, and through service spaces without appearing out of place. Press, a journalist perhaps, or more likely someone employed by Hartwell himself, a private secretary, an investigator of some kind. Someone he kept close and kept quiet and kept, when necessary, invisible. Someone who had gone into Eleanor's suite that morning not to help her, but to check on her, to report back, to ensure that the bride was where she was supposed to be, and was not, as it turned out, doing precisely what she was doing, which meant that whatever Eleanor had done, she had done it between the departure of Hartwell's woman and the arrival of the maid, a window of, at most, 20 minutes. 20 minutes to arrange a veil, write a note, hide it, open a panel, and disappear into a passage that no one was supposed to know about. Poirot set down his cup. She had been extraordinarily composed, or extraordinarily terrified. Sometimes he had found they looked the same from the outside. He went back to the suite at 12:30. The young constable, whose name was Briggs, and who had the large hands and slightly bewildered expression of someone not entirely certain how he had ended up involved in whatever this was still at the door. He admitted Poirot without comment, having already learned that commenting produced lengthy explanations that he was not sure he followed. The room was unchanged. Finch had been true to his word on that at least. Poirot stood in the centre and did his second examination, which was technically his third examination, but the second proper one, done now with the additional information of the morning's interviews arranged neatly in the back of his mind. He began not with the blood or the veil, he had extracted what he could from those, but with the dressing table, the perfume bottles, 4 of them, arranged in a loose semicircle. He looked at them without touching. 3 were full, or nearly so. The 4th, a small square bottle of something French and expensive, was empty. Not merely used down, but completely empty, and the stopper had been replaced very precisely. He picked it up and turned it, dry inside. Not recently emptied. Emptied some time ago and kept, which was unusual. People did not generally keep empty perfume bottles on their dressing tables, unless it had been emptied on purpose, for another use. He set it aside. The powder compact, open. He looked at the powder, undisturbed on one side, but on the other, a small depression, a circular mark, as though something round and small had rested in it. About the diameter of a coin, or a... He looked at the empty perfume bottle again. The base of the bottle was circular. He held it over the mark in the powder, a perfect match. The bottle had been kept for the powder, or rather, what had been put in place of the powder. He opened the compact fully. Beneath the thin remaining layer of pressed powder on the undisturbed side, he pressed gently with one finger. Something solid underneath. Paper, folded very small and flat. He extracted it with great care, using the edge of his thumbnail, and unfolded it on the dressing table. A list, written in the same hand as the note in the drawer. Eleanor's hand, he was now certain, with its slightly leftward lean, and the particular way it formed the letter E. But this was not hasty writing. This was deliberate, precise, 8 lines. Each line contained a name, a date, and a number. He read it twice, then he read it a third time, more slowly. The names were not names he recognized. The dates ran from 1948 to 1951. The numbers were large and the kind of numbers that belonged to shipping contracts or property transactions, or his eyes moved back to the names and he thought about what Ashby had said. Hartwell is a man who collects things. These were not transactions, they were payments, and the names beside them were not business partners. They were, he was nearly certain, people who had been paid to be silent. This was what Eleanor had found in Hartwell's study 6 weeks ago. Not the original documents, those would be locked away somewhere inaccessible, but she had seen them, or enough of them, and was to reconstruct this list from memory. She had hidden it in a powder compact on her own dressing table, in a room that Hartwell would have every right to enter, being her fiancé, in a hotel where she was registered under the booking he had arranged and paid for, hidden in plain sight. Poirot looked at the list for a long moment. Then he folded it and placed it beside the note from the drawer in his breast pocket and turned to the blood. He crouched beside the stain again, his knees registering their by now familiar protest, which he ignored with practiced determination, and looked at it from a new angle. Lower, more sideways. From this angle, something he had not noticed before became visible. At the edge of the stain, barely perceptible against the pale carpet, and a second mark. Smaller, circular, about the size of a finger ring, or a small bottle stopper. He looked at the empty perfume bottle on the dressing table, then back at the mark on the carpet. He stood up slowly, his mind rearranging itself around a new possibility. The blood was not from a wound, or rather, it might be from a wound, but not an accidental one. Not a struggle, not an attack, not an injury sustained in flight. The blood had been placed here, deliberately, carefully. The perfume bottle, emptied of its original contents, had been used as a small vessel, filled with blood obtained in advance, carried to this spot, poured with precise aim to create exactly the right amount of alarm without suggesting something fatal. Enough to be found, not enough to suggest death. A prop, like the veil, like the unlocked door. Eleanor Voss had staged this scene. She had laid out the veil, poured the blood, hidden the note in the drawer, not too hidden, just hidden enough, and then walked into the passage and closed the panel behind her. She had created, in 20 minutes or less, a scene that would do 2 things simultaneously. First, alarm the hotel enough to call in outside help. Someone, anyone who was not in Hartwell's pocket. Second, leave enough genuine evidence of her actual situation that anyone intelligent enough to look would find it. The list in the powder compact, the note with its 6 words, the staged blood that, if you looked at it long enough from the right angle, revealed itself as staged. She had been counting on someone to look. Poirot straightened up and pressed his palm flat against the wall panel, the way he had done before, and felt it shift under the gentle pressure. He looked into the dark passage. There was, he thought, one more thing the passage might tell him that he had not yet asked it. He did not particularly want to go in. He went in. The passage was narrow and cold and smelled of decades of disuse. The ceiling was low enough that Poirot, who was not a tall man, still felt the instinctive hunch of the confined space. He moved his torch slowly from side to side as he walked, watching the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The disturbed dust trail continued ahead of him, Eleanor's passage marked in the grey and undeniable record of the floor. Small boot prints he could see now. A woman's boots, narrow-heeled, pointing away from the suite. She had walked quickly but not run. The stride was regular, purposeful. He followed the trail to where the passage turned left. Around the corner, the passage widened slightly and then terminated at a second panel, identical to the first. Poirot pressed it in the same manner and it swung inward, opening onto a small service landing between 2 floors. A narrow staircase ran downward from here, metal-edged, the kind used by staff in the old days of the hotel's operation. He shone his torch down the stairs. At the bottom, a door. He descended carefully, one hand on the wall for balance, and examined the door. It was old but functional, the bolt drawn back. Someone had unbolted it from this side and passed through. He opened it. A service corridor. Bare walls, stone floor, strip lighting overhead. It ran east and west, connecting, he judged, to the hotel's lower service level. The kitchens, the laundry, the delivery's entrance, which opened onto a side street, used by tradesmen and suppliers, and which at 10:30 in the morning on a weekday would have been busy enough that a woman emerging from it in a dark coat would have attracted no attention whatsoever. Poirot stood in the service corridor and allowed himself a small, private moment of admiration. Eleanor Voss had not panicked. She had not improvised. She had planned a route from her bridal suite to the street in such a way that she could not be followed, could not be intercepted, and left behind her a scene carefully calibrated to be both alarming and informative. She had used the hotel against itself, its history, its architecture, its multiple exits and service routes, with the thoroughness of someone who had spent considerable time studying it. She asked me quite casually whether I knew anything about the history of the Savoy, Ashby's words, and now Poirot understood the casualness, not indifference, but cover, the careful lightness of someone asking important questions under the guise of idle curiosity. She had researched the building, she had found the passage, she had planned the exit. She had been preparing, Poirot thought, for weeks. He emerged from the service corridor into the lower ground floor and made his way back up through the hotel, emerging into the main lobby with the slightly dishevelled look of a man who's been in places not intended for hotel guests. Briggs, whom he passed near the lift, looked at him with polite alarm and said nothing. In the lobby, Poirot paused. He needed to think about what he knew and what he still did not know. And he needed to do this systematically. What he knew: Eleanor had staged the scene in the suite and escaped via a hidden passage to the street. She had help from Diana Marsh, money, a train ticket, a key to a flat in Edinburgh. She was carrying, he believed, the reconstructed list from the powder compact, or a version of it. She had something that could destroy Hartwell. Hartwell knew she was gone. He knew about the blood, Finch had told him. He had presented himself to Poirot as controlled, unbothered, dismissive. This was performance. Underneath it, something was working very hard. There was a tall woman, connected to Hartwell, operating in the hotel, who had visited Eleanor's suite that morning between 10 and 10:15. She had brought something. Not money, not a key, something small, that she had no longer in her hand when she left. This last point, Poirot thought, was the one he had not yet resolved. What had she brought? Not a weapon. There had been no violence, not a letter. The timing suggested not enough time for reading and response. Something delivered, something left. A warning? A threat? He turned this over in his mind as he crossed the lobby, and he was halfway to the reading room when he stopped. Near the reception desk, half concealed by a large arrangement of autumn flowers, a woman was standing. Tall, dark coat, brown hair, very neat. She was looking at the lift, and as Poirot watched, she glanced, just once, quickly, toward the main entrance of the hotel, and then back at the lift. And there was something in the quality of that glance, the brevity of it, and the precision that told him she was not waiting for someone to arrive. She was watching for someone to leave. She was watching, Poirot realized, in case Eleanor Voss somehow came back. Or, more likely, she was watching in case someone left the hotel to follow Eleanor, in case Poirot left the hotel to follow Eleanor. She was not Hartwell's assistant. She was his watchman. Poirot did not look at her. He walked to the reading room at his usual pace, sat down in the leather armchair and spent 3 minutes staring at the wall. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote, beneath the 3 names he had written that morning, a 4th. Beneath it he wrote a question: working for Hartwell or working against him? He looked at the question for a moment, then slowly he drew a line through 4 and left against standing on its own. Because the woman in the lobby was watching to see if anyone followed Eleanor, and a person employed to prevent Eleanor's escape would not be watching the front door, she would be watching the back one. Poirot sat with this thought for a long, quiet moment. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket and went to find her. Forced into white. She did not run. That was the first thing Poirot noticed as he approached her. A guilty person, or a frightened one, would have seen him coming and found a reason to be elsewhere. She did not. She watched him cross the lobby toward her with the calm, measured attention of someone who had been expecting this, and had decided at some point between then and now that it was all right. She was perhaps 32. Up close, the sharpness of her face resolved itself into something more specific. High cheekbones, a firm jaw, dark eyes that assessed him with professional thoroughness. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but she had the kind of presence that made beauty beside the point. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, Her voice was low, unhurried. Educated, but not the education of money. The education of effort. "You have the advantage of me," Poirot said pleasantly. "My name is Catherine Rowan," she said. I was employed by Edward Hartwell as a private secretary." She paused slightly on the word "was." "I have been employed by him for 4 years." "And now," Poirot said. She looked at him steadily. "Now," she said, "I would very much like to sit down somewhere quiet and tell you several things that I should have told someone a considerable time ago." They sat in the reading room with the door closed and the autumn light coming grey and even through the window. Catherine sat opposite him with her coat still on, as though she had not entirely decided to stay. She spoke without preamble, without any of the hesitations or redirections of someone constructing a story as they went. She spoke like someone reciting facts already organised in their own mind. Ordered, unembellished, delivered with the flat precision of a person who has been holding something for too long and has finally found a place to put it down. "Edward Hartwell," she said, "has been running a secondary business alongside his shipping interests for approximately 8 years. It has no registered office. It exists entirely in private arrangements and untraceable payments, and it concerns itself with one specific commodity." She paused. "Information," she said. "Other people's secrets, obtained through surveillance, coercion, occasionally theft, and held as leverage. Against businessmen, politicians, minor public figures, anyone with something to lose." Poirot was very still. "He is a blackmailer," he said. He prefers to think of it as strategic relationship management," Catherine said, with a precision that was itself a kind of contempt. "But yes, he is a blackmailer." She looked at her hands briefly. "I didn't know this when I took the position. I suspected something within the first year. I knew, with certainty, by the end of the second." She looked up. "I stayed because I was building a record, because I believed that if I left without it, nothing would ever be done, and he would simply continue." "And the record," Poirot said. "Is no longer in my possession," she said, "as of this morning." "You were in the suite," Poirot said. "Between 10 and 10:15, you brought something small." "A package," Catherine said. "Small, flat, wrapped in brown paper. It contained copies of documents from Hartwell's private files, the ones Eleanor had partially reconstructed from memory." She met his eyes. She had the reconstruction. I had the copies. Together they constitute a complete record of 8 years of systematic blackmail involving 14 individuals. "You sought Eleanor out," Poirot said. 5 weeks ago," Catherine confirmed. "I had been watching Hartwell's correspondence. I knew he was forcing her into the marriage. I knew why." Something in her expression briefly relented. "I went to her. We made a plan. She would leave this morning during the window between my visit and the maid's arrival, take the documents, and be gone before anyone knew she was missing, on her way to Edinburgh beyond his reach." "And you?" Poirot said. "I had rather hoped," she said, with a slight dry expression, "to be a good deal further from this hotel by now." "Why are you not?" "Because the documents are only useful if someone with authority acts on them," she said. "Eleanor taking them to Edinburgh accomplishes nothing by itself. She is not a lawyer. She's not a police inspector. I stayed because I needed to find someone independent, someone Hartwell has no hold over, who would understand what the documents mean." She looked at him steadily. "I had rather hoped it might be you." "Tell me about James Voss," Poirot said. "Eleanor's brother," Catherine said carefully. "James did get into financial trouble. He was 20, he was foolish. There is a genuine paper trail of genuine wrongdoing," she paused. "But Hartwell did not discover this accidentally. He arranged it. He had people watching Eleanor after their first meeting, assessing her vulnerabilities. James's situation was identified, and Hartwell acquired the debt and the legal exposure before Eleanor even knew it existed." Another pause. "It was not an opportunistic threat. It was constructed. From the beginning." "From the beginning," Poirot repeated quietly. "Hartwell does not meet people by accident." Poirot thought about the charity function, the subsequent generosity, the paid debts, the attentiveness. All of it, from the first handshake, a structure being built around a woman who did not know she was inside it. He felt, briefly and genuinely, a cold anger, the kind that did not heat or flush but settled, like something dense at the base of the stomach. "Among the 14 people on the list," he said, "are any in a position to act quickly, to have Hartwell arrested before he destroys evidence?" "There is a man named Alderton," Catherine said. "Sir William Alderton. Hartwell has held something over him for 3 years. Something personal, not criminal. but wielded effectively. She paused. He is currently Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. The silence that followed was of a different quality. Interesting, Poirot said softly. If Alderton knew the threat could be neutralized, Catherine said, he would act, quickly, and with considerable authority. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end, Poirot had a plan, reasonably sound, dependent on perhaps 3 things going correctly that could theoretically go wrong. A better ratio than most plans achieved. He also had a telephone number for Sergeant Mills, who was attached to the Metropolitan Police and was, according to Catherine, both trustworthy and in possession of the kind of quiet courage more useful than the loud variety. He was standing to leave when he remembered something. "The note Eleanor left in the drawer," he said. "He knows. I had no choice. What does he know specifically?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks ago, she said, Eleanor found a letter in his correspondence, badly sealed. One edge had not held. She read, without touching it, 5 lines through the gap. Her voice was level. They contained her name and a question about her progress with certain material she was believed to have accessed. He had known for weeks, Poirot said. He had known since shortly after she found the folder, Catherine confirmed. He said nothing. Continued with the wedding plans, the flowers, the dinners, managing her, watching her, because keeping her contained was easier than the alternative while they were not yet married. Once they were married, Poirot said quietly, her legal position changed considerably. Her access to independent action, financially, legally, became significantly more complicated. She paused. He was not waiting for a wedding, Monsieur Poirot. He was waiting for a cage to close. And she knew this, Poirot said. She knew this, Catherine said. The note was... She told me she wanted whoever found it to understand that she had not run from a marriage. She had run from a trap. That she had made a choice, perhaps the first entirely free choice she had been permitted to make in 14 months. He knows. I had no choice. Poirot stood in the quiet reading room with the rain beginning outside and the full weight of the morning arranged in his mind with complete clarity. He understood now. Everything. Except one thing. Whether Hartwell moved first. The net closes. The gathering took 30 minutes to arrange. Poirot did not call it a confrontation. He never did, privately. He called it, in the neat shorthand of his own thinking, a clarification. A bringing together of separate threads in the same room so that their relationship to one another became visible. He had done this many times, in many rooms, in many countries, and it never became entirely routine. There was always, beneath the professional competence, a small residue of something he could not quite name. Not nerves, not quite. The knowledge, perhaps, that the moment before the truth came out was the last moment in which certain things could be undone. After that moment, nothing could be undone. And he asked Finch to use the private dining room on the 2nd floor, a room small enough to feel enclosed but not so small as to feel aggressive. Finch complied with the anxious efficiency of a man who has spent the entire day being told what to do and is deeply grateful for it. A fire was lit. 6 chairs were arranged around the table, not in the manner of a dinner party, but not entirely unlike one either. Poirot had also, quietly and without particular ceremony, placed a telephone call from Finch's office to Sergeant Mills, whose number he had memorized. The conversation had been brief, 3 minutes, perhaps 4, and at the end of it Mills had said, in the flat, careful tone of a man recalibrating his afternoon, that he would be at the Savoy within the hour. 1 hour. Poirot needed the room to do its work within that hour. He thought it would be sufficient. They came in separately, which he had arranged deliberately. Lord Ashby first, who arrived with his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man who has been waiting all day for something to happen, and is relieved that it finally is. He took the chair nearest the fire without being asked, and looked around the room with the assessing calm of someone who has sat at many tables and learned to read them. Diana Marsh second, who came in with her coat buttoned to the collar and her chin slightly raised, which Poirot recognized as the posture of someone prepared to defend something they care about. She sat across from Ashby and did not look at anyone else immediately. Catherine Rowan third, who entered with the quiet, deliberate step of a person walking into a room they have been dreading and have decided to walk into anyway. She took the chair nearest the door, which Poirot noted without comment. Finch fourth, hovering near the wall rather than sitting, his hands doing their button-related calculations. Poirot indicated a chair with a gentle but unambiguous gesture, and Finch sat. Hartwell last. He did not come immediately. There was a pause of perhaps 2 minutes between Finch's fourth arrival and the door opening again, and Poirot used those 2 minutes to look at the room, at the specific quality of silence that had settled over it, and found it informative. Ashby was watching the fire. Diana was watching her hands. Catherine was watching the door. Finch was watching Poirot. None of them were watching each other, which told him that each of them was, in their own way, alone with what they knew, and that what they knew was not the same thing. They were not conspirators in the same direction. They were people who had each, separately, found themselves standing at the edge of the same situation, looking at it from different angles. The door opened. Hartwell came in. He assessed the room in one sweep. Poirot saw it happen, the quick intelligence behind the composed face, and then he sat. He chose the chair at the head of the table, which had not been designated as such, but which he occupied immediately and completely, with the ease of a man who assumes that wherever he sits becomes the head. He looked at Poirot. "You found her," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have found a great deal," Poirot said pleasantly. "Whether I have found Miss Voss in the specific sense you mean is a matter we will come to." He sat down himself in the chair opposite Hartwell and placed his hands flat on the table. "I have asked you all here because there are certain things which need to be said aloud, in the presence of witnesses, and it is better, much better, that they are said by me than that they are said later, in a less comfortable room, by people with less agreeable manners." He looked around the table. "I will begin," he said, "with what I know, and then we will discuss what is to happen next." He began with the suite. He described it without drama: the veil, the blood, the note, the compact, the passage. He described these things with the flat precision of a man reading from a list, and he watched the room as he did so. Ashby listened with the still attention of a man receiving confirmation of things he had largely already suspected. Diana went very still at the mention of the compact. Catherine's expression did not change. She had, he knew, already heard some of this, but she listened as though she had not. Finch made a small, distressed sound at the mention of the passage, the particular distress of a hotel manager learning that his building has architectural secrets he was not aware of. Hartwell said nothing. His face said nothing. He sat with his elbows on the table and his fingers loosely interlaced and watched Poirot with the measured attention of a man deciding in real time how much of what he is hearing is dangerous. The blood, Poirot said, was staged, deliberately placed by Miss Voss herself, and using a small vessel, an emptied perfume bottle, to create the impression of an emergency. It was not, I believe, her blood, or rather, it may have been a very small quantity of her own blood, but not from any serious injury. He paused. She cut her palm, probably several days ago. She had been preparing. He saw it, just barely. A fractional tightening around Hartwell's eyes, so small that anyone who was not looking specifically for it would have missed it entirely. Not surprise, something else. Recalculation. He knows. Eleanor's note. And Poirot understood it now with full precision. Hartwell had known she had seen the files. He had known for weeks. He had been managing her, watching her, keeping her contained while he waited for the wedding to close the trap. But what he had not known, what the tightening around his eyes said he had not known, was that she had been this prepared, that she had carried the plan this far without his detecting it. He had underestimated her. This was, Poirot thought, his first and most significant mistake. "I will now speak," Poirot said, "about Mr. Edward Hartwell." He said it quietly, conversationally, in the tone one might use to introduce a topic of mild general interest. Hartwell looked at him. "For approximately 8 years," Poirot said, "Mr. Hartwell has maintained a secondary enterprise alongside his legitimate business interests. This enterprise concerns itself with the acquisition and deployment of compromising information about individuals of influence. It is, to use the precise term, blackmail." He paused. "It involves, at last count, 14 individuals. I have their names, I have dates, I have amounts." He touched his breast pocket briefly. "I also have, in the possession of a trusted third party, copies of the original documentation from which this information derives." The room was absolutely silent. "What Miss Voss discovered in Mr. Hartwell's study 6 weeks ago," Poirot continued, "was not simply damaging to his reputation. It was, and remains, sufficient cause for criminal prosecution on multiple counts. The marriage, The forcing of Miss Voss into this marriage through the manufactured legal vulnerability of her brother was not, as one might initially suppose, a personal matter. It was professional. He looked at Hartwell steadily. Miss Voss had seen the files. She had understood what she saw. Hartwell could not allow her to be free. A free woman with that knowledge was a liability he could not manage. A wife, however, cannot testify against her husband. Diana made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath, the kind that comes when something suspected is confirmed. Ashby had not moved. His face was very composed and very cold. So, the wedding, Poirot said, was not a solution to a problem of the heart. It was a solution to a problem of evidence. Hartwell spoke for the first time. "This," he said, "is a remarkable collection of speculation." His voice was exactly as it had been all morning, low, controlled, unhurried. The voice of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has learned that the voice is the last thing to give way. "It is," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "And yet here we are, 6 people in a room, and not one of them is looking at you with surprise, Mr. Hartwell. Dismay, perhaps, confirmation, relief in 1 or 2 cases." He paused, but not surprise. Hartwell looked around the table. It was, Poirot thought, an interesting moment. The moment when a man accustomed to being the only person in the room who knows everything discovers that this is no longer true. Something shifted in Hartwell's face. Not a collapse, nothing so theatrical, but a very slight adjustment, like a building settling. "You have nothing that constitutes legal evidence?" Hartwell said. "Not in this room, no," Poirot said. "The documents themselves are elsewhere, in the possession of Miss Voss, who is, as you have surmised, not in this hotel." He paused. "However, the documents are shortly to be in the possession of someone rather more authoritative than a frightened bride, and at that point the question of legal evidence will answer itself fairly quickly." Hartwell looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, rapid, invisible to anyone not watching for it. Calculation, options. The specific focus of a man who is losing and knows it, and has not yet decided whether to negotiate or attack. "I would like," he said carefully, "to speak with my solicitor." "By all means," Poirot said. "You will have that opportunity very shortly. I have taken the liberty of—" He stopped, because at that moment Hartwell stood up, not dramatically, not with anger. He simply stood in one smooth motion and looked at the door, and Poirot understood immediately and completely what he was about to do. He was not going to wait for a solicitor. He was not going to negotiate. He had done his rapid calculation, the documents, the copies, the trusted third party, and he had arrived at his conclusion. And his conclusion was that the only remaining useful action was to make himself very difficult to find very quickly. He was going to run, and Poirot, who was 63 years old and whose knees had been expressing strong opinions all day, was not going to be able to stop him physically. He did not need to. The door opened. Sergeant Mills came in. He was a compact man, not large, not small, with a face that was forgettable in the way that only very observant faces can be, and the quiet, settled manner of someone who has learned to enter rooms without announcing himself. He was in plain clothes. He had 2 uniformed constables behind him, invisible in the corridor through the open door, but he himself stepped into the room alone and closed the door behind him. He looked at Poirot. Poirot gave the smallest possible nod. Mills looked at Hartwell. "Mr. Edward Hartwell," he said. Not loudly, the way you say something that doesn't need volume because the room is already listening. "I wonder if you'd be willing to accompany us." Hartwell looked at him, then at Poirot. "You telephoned the police," he said. 45 minutes ago, Poirot agreed, from Mr. Finch's office. Mr. Finch was kind enough to leave me alone for the duration of the call, which I appreciated. He paused. "I also took the liberty of telephoning a colleague of Sergeant Mills, a superior officer in fact, who has been made aware of the contents of the document list and who has, I understand, a certain personal motivation to act on the matter with considerable speed." Hartwell was still for 3 seconds. Then something in his face, the last of the composure, the final carefully maintained surface, went out, like a light switched off. What remained underneath was not rage, not grief, not any of the things Poirot might have predicted. It was simply tiredness, the specific, profound tiredness of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, involuntarily, put it down. He sat back down. "All right," he said quietly. Finch, who had been gripping the edge of his chair for the last 10 minutes with both hands, exhaled a breath that seemed to have been building since approximately 9 o'clock that morning. Diana had her eyes closed. Her shoulders, which had been rigid since she walked in, had dropped by perhaps 2 inches. Ashby looked at the fire. Catherine Rowan sat very still near the door, her hands folded, her face composed. But Poirot, glancing at her, saw that her hands were not quite steady, a fine tremor, barely perceptible, the kind that comes not from fear but from the sudden release of attention held for a very long time. 3 years, she had said. He thought about that. 3 years of sitting across a desk from Hartwell, taking his letters, managing his schedule, building her quiet record while he used her as part of the furniture of his operation. 3 years of knowing and waiting and calculating whether the right moment would ever come. He looked at her and gave a small private nod. She looked back at him. Something in her expression, not quite a smile, but the intention of one. Now Mills remained with Hartwell. The 2 uniformed constables came in from the corridor. The room rearranged itself around this new geometry. Hartwell at the table with Mills beside him, the rest of them drifting by mutual unspoken agreement toward the far end of the room. Poirot stood by the window. He was, he realized, quite tired. Not the tired of having done too much, the tired of having held too many things in his mind for too many hours at once. The case had not been physically taxing by most standards. No one had shot at him, which was always agreeable, and he had not been required to run at any point, for which his knees were grateful. But the thinking had been continuous and dense, the way complicated things always were, and he felt it now in the way he always felt it afterward. A slight hollow quality, as though the thinking had temporarily displaced something else, and the something else had not yet returned. He thought about Eleanor, on a train by now if everything had gone as planned, sitting in a third-class carriage with her coat collar up and a small parcel of documents in her bag and a train ticket to Edinburgh in her pocket. Looking out at the English countryside moving past the window, the flat fields, the distant trees, the grey October sky that looked the same from a train as it did from the window of the Savoy, but from a train meant something entirely different. Freedom, that sky. The same sky, differently inhabited. He hoped, very sincerely, that she was warm enough. He hoped she was sleeping. He thought she probably was not. Ashby appeared at his elbow. "It's done then," Ashby said. Not a question. "The beginning of done," Poirot said. "There is still the matter of the documents, the formal charges, the case to be made properly. That will take time. These things always take time. But Hartwell will not be in a position to threaten anyone in the immediate future," Poirot said. "And when the documents are in the proper hands, which will be shortly, the case against him will be, I think, difficult to escape." Ashby was quiet for a moment. "James Voss," he said. "Eleanor's brother, the manufactured trouble." "When the full scope of Hartwell's operation is established," Poirot said, "the manufactured nature of James's situation will be part of that record. These things unravel once you begin to pull the right thread." He paused. "He will be all right, I think," Ashby nodded slowly. "And Eleanor?" "Eleanor," Poirot said, "just will decide for herself what comes next, which is, I believe, precisely what she wanted." Ashby looked at him. "You admire her," he said. Poirot considered this. "I admire clear thinking under great pressure," he said. "It is not common. She had it in abundance." He paused. "I also think she's someone who is not permitted for some time to be entirely herself. People who have been compressed like that, they are remarkable when they finally have room." Ashby said nothing, but the look on his face, the old man standing by the window in the grey afternoon light, thinking about a young woman he had known since her father was alive, said something quiet and genuine that Poirot did not press. Some things did not need pressing. Diana came to find him before she left. She stood in front of him with her coat buttoned and her hands at her sides, and looked at him with those sharp red-rimmed eyes that had been, all morning, slightly ahead of everything she was willing to say. "She'll be all right," Diana said. It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. "Yes," Poirot said, "I believe she will." Diana looked at him for a moment longer, then she nodded. A small, single nod of the kind that closes something. "Thank you," she said. "It is I who should thank you," Poirot said. "Without what you did this morning, the money, the ticket, the key, none of the rest of it would have been possible. Eleanor's plan was very well constructed, but plans require execution. You executed it." Diana looked at him. She asked me to help her, she said simply. She's my friend. She said it the way one states a fact that is also a complete explanation, because it was. Poirot watched her go. He thought, friendship is also a form of courage. People forgot this sometimes. He did not forget it. The truth behind the veil. The telephone call came at 4:30. Poirot was in his room by then, sitting in the armchair by the window with his shoes off and his feet on the footstool and a cup of tea going cold on the side table. He had been sitting this way for 20 minutes, doing nothing in particular, which his body greeted with the enthusiasm of a long-neglected indulgence. The telephone rang. He looked at it for one moment and then picked it up. Monsieur Poirot? The voice was young, slightly breathless, female, Scottish vowels underneath the breathlessness. You don't know me. My name is Eleanor Voss. Poirot sat up slowly. Miss Voss, he said. I know you rather better than you might suppose. A pause. Then a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but occupied the uncertain territory between them. Diana said you would say something like that, she said. She had telephoned from a call box near Edinburgh Waverley Station. She had arrived 2 hours earlier. The train had been crowded and she had sat in a corner seat with her coat on her lap and her bag between her feet and had not slept, as Poirot had suspected, but had watched the landscape move past the window and had thought, she said, about very little, which was, she said, the most extraordinary luxury she had experienced in 14 months. Diana telephoned me at the station, she said. She told me what happened, that that Mills came. Yes, Poirot said, and the documents are in hand, Poirot said. Sergeant Mills has been in contact with his superior, who's acting with considerable speed. The documents you carry are safe where they are. Someone will be in contact regarding their formal submission. He paused. It will be handled carefully. My brother, she said, James. Will be all right, Poirot said. The manufactured nature of his situation is part of the record. When the record is fully established, it will be addressed. He paused. I give you my word, Miss Voss, I do not give it lightly. A silence. He heard, very faintly, Edinburgh street sounds through the call-box glass. I didn't know if anyone would understand, she said, what I left behind. I didn't know if it would just look like chaos, a frightened woman who ran. It did not look like chaos, Poirot said. It looked like precisely what it was. A mind working clearly under very difficult conditions. He paused. The powder compact was, I think, particularly elegant. She made a sound, genuine, brief, surprised. The first thing he had heard from her that was entirely unguarded. I was terrified I'd pressed too hard, she said, that it would be obvious. To someone looking casually, it was not obvious at all, Poirot said. To someone looking carefully, it was exactly obvious enough. You were looking carefully. It is, Poirot said. What I do. She talked for 20 minutes. He had not asked her to. She simply talked, and he listened, in the manner of someone who has been silent for a very long time, and has finally found a line that is safe to speak into. She told him about the charity function. Hartwell had been charming, the particular charm of a man who makes you feel you are the only interesting person in a dull room. She had been tired and cold and not inclined to be flattered, but she had been polite, and he had found her polite, and that had been that. The attention had followed. Flowers, dinners, the offer to deal with her father's debts, presented so carefully, so without obvious strings, that she had not seen the strings until they were already tied. There was a week, perhaps 2, when I believed it was genuine, she said. And then there was one moment when I looked at him across a dinner table and saw something in his face that didn't fit. He was talking about something ordinary. Wine, I think. And for just a second his eyes went somewhere else. Calculating. A pause. The face of a man checking something. And I was the thing being checked. And after that moment, Poirot said, I watched him the way he was watching me, she said. I'm not sure I succeeded in hiding it. I think he always knew I was more aware than I appeared. It may be why he accelerated the timeline, the engagement, the wedding date, all of it faster than I expected. She stopped. He wanted the door closed before I had time to use it. But you found the study first, Poirot said. I wasn't looking for anything specific, and I was looking for a pen. His study door was unlocked, which it usually wasn't. I found a pen. I also found a folder on the desk, open. He had been called away and hadn't locked up properly. She paused. I read enough in 5 minutes to understand what he was. I took nothing. I was frightened to take anything, but I remembered what I read. And when I got back to my room, I wrote it down from memory. The list, Poirot said. The list, she confirmed. I hid it in the compact because it was the one place I thought was genuinely mine. Hartwell had access to my bag, my correspondence, everything else, but my compact seemed small enough, ordinary enough, a slight pause. Silly, perhaps. Not at all, Poirot said. It was the last place anyone would look carelessly, and the first place someone looking very carefully would find eventually. She told him about the letter from Liverpool, 2 weeks ago, badly sealed, left on the hall table by mistake. She had read 5 lines through the gap without touching it, her name, and a question about material she was believed to have accessed. She had pressed it closed and gone upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and he knew, he had known for weeks, had continued with the flowers and the wedding plans and the quiet management of her movements, waiting for the door to close. I telephoned Diana that evening, Eleanor said. I told her we had to move the plan forward, to the wedding day itself. I couldn't disappear before then without him acting against James. She paused. She didn't hesitate, she just said, All right, what do you need? The blood, Poirot said. Was it obvious that it was staged? Not immediately, he said honestly. The circular mark at the edge of the stain, the bottom of the bottle, that was what confirmed it. I was shaking when I poured it, she said quietly. I had to put the bottle down twice and breathe. And yet you did it, Poirot said. The shaking is irrelevant. What the hands do is what matters. A pause. That's a kind thing to say, she said. It is an accurate thing to say, Poirot said. I am sometimes kind. I am always accurate. This particular statement has the good fortune to be both. She laughed. Real, brief, unguarded. Very possibly the first genuinely free sound she had made in 14 months. After he replaced the receiver, Poirot sat for a while with his cold tea in the darkening window. He thought about Eleanor in a quiet Edinburgh flat, a bag of documents at her feet, whatever she had in her pockets when she walked out of the Savoy that morning in her going-away coat instead of her bridal gown. He thought about Hartwell in a police station, sitting very straight, still calculating, still believing there was an angle from which this could be managed. There was not. He thought about Catherine Rowan, who had left at 3 o'clock with the quiet step of a woman who has put down something heavy and is deciding where to go now that her hands are free. She had shaken his hand at the door. She had not said thank you. She had simply said, it was well done, and walked out and turned left and disappeared. He thought about Diana, who had done what friends do in real trouble. Not the comfortable kind of help, but the kind that costs something and is offered anyway. He reached for his tea, completely cold. He drank it anyway. There was one last thing. Eleanor had described reading the Liverpool letter without touching it. She had pressed it closed and left it exactly as she had found it, which meant Hartwell, coming home, would have found it undisturbed. He would not have known she had read it, like he would have continued believing he was the only person in the room who knew everything. He had not known that she had already, quietly, precisely, without leaving a single visible mark, stepped entirely outside the situation he had constructed for her. She had been free, in the only way that mattered, for 2 weeks before she walked out of the Savoy. The dinners, the flowers, the patient performance of those final 2 weeks, all of it voluntary. Her choice, not his management, but her strategy. Poirot looked at the window. The street lamps were steady in the dark. The Thames moved somewhere beyond the embankment with its old, indifferent patience. She walked out of that hotel on her own terms, not fleeing, not escaping, leaving. There was a difference. He was glad she knew it. He picked up his book. He read the first paragraph. And he read it again. He closed it and set it on the side table and looked at the ceiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work is done. Somewhere to the north, a young woman sat in a quiet flat and looked at her own hands, steady, finally, and thought about what she might do next. Whatever it was, it would be entirely her own idea. That, Poirot decided, was the best possible ending. He closed his eyes. The little grey cell, satisfied, went quiet.